Hi, welcome to part 3 of Esio Trot. Right, let's go. So remember yesterday he had gone out and bought over 100 tortoises, all different sizes. So let's see what his plan was. Before he retired, Mr Hoppy had been a mechanic in a bus garage. Now he went back to his old place of work and asked his mates if he might use his old bench for an hour or two. What he had to do now was to make something that would reach down from the balcony to Mrs Silver's balcony and pick up a tortoise. This was not difficult for a mechanic like Mr Hoppy. First he made 2 metal claws or fingers, and these he attached to the end of a long metal tube. He ran 2 stiff wires down inside the tube and connected them to the metal claws in such a way that when you pulled the wires, the claws closed, and when you pushed them, the claws opened. The wires were joined to a handle at the other end of the tube. It was all very simple, and Mr Hoppy was ready. There's his tool he's made. You can see it at the bottom there. It's like a litter picker, isn't it? One of those claw grabby things. Mrs Silver had a part-time job. She worked from noon until 5 o'clock every weekday afternoon in a shop that sold newspapers and sweets. That made things a lot easier for Mr Hoppy. So on that very first exciting afternoon, after he had made sure that Mrs Silver had gone to work, Mr Hoppy went out on his balcony armed with his long metal pole. He called this his tortoise catcher. He leaned over the balcony railings and lowered the pole down onto Mrs Silver's balcony below. Alfie was basking in the pale sunlight over to one side. "Hello, Alfie," said Mr Hoppy. "You're about to go for a little ride." He wiggled the tortoise catcher until it was right above Alfie. He pushed the hand lever so that the claws opened wide, and then he lowered the claws down neatly over Alfie's shell and pulled the lever. The claws closed tight over the shell like 2 fingers of a hand. He hauled Alfie up onto his own balcony. It was easy. There he is, hauling Alfie. He got him first and then he pulled him up. Look at Alfie, he's flying through the air now. He's probably a bit frightened. Mr Hoppy weighed Alfie on his own kitchen scales, just to make sure that Mrs Silver's figure of 13 ounces was correct. It was. Now, holding Alfie in one hand, he picked his way carefully through his collection of tortoises to find one that first of all had the exact same colour shell as Alfie's, and secondly weighed exactly 2 ounces more. So 13 add 2, 15. 2 ounces is not much. It is less than a smallish hen's egg weighs. But you see, his important thing in Mr Hoppy's plan was to make sure that the new tortoise was bigger than Alfie, but only a tiny bit bigger. The difference had to be so small that Mrs Silver wouldn't even notice it. From his vast collection, it was not difficult for Mr Hoppy to find a tortoise he wanted. He wanted one that weighed 15 ounces exactly on his kitchen scales, no more, no less. When he had got it, he put it on the kitchen table beside Alfie, and even he could hardly tell that one was bigger than the other. But it was bigger. It was bigger by 2 ounces. This was tortoise number 2. Mr Hoppy took tortoise number 2 out onto the balcony and he gripped it in the claws of his tortoise catcher. Then he lowered it down onto Mrs Silver's balcony, right beside a nice fresh lettuce. Tortoise number 2 had never eaten tender juicy lettuce leaves before. It had only had thick old cabbage leaves. It loved the lettuce and started chomping away at it with great gusto. There followed a rather nervous 2 hours wait for Mrs Silver to return from work. Would she see any difference between the new tortoise and Alfie? It was going to be a tense moment. So there's Mr Hoppy weighing out the tortoises, and there is him putting the new tortoise number 2, down onto the balcony. Out on her balcony swept Mrs Silver. "Alfie, my darling," she cried, "Mummy's back. Have you missed me?" Mr Hoppy, peering over his railing, but well hidden between 2 huge pot plants, held his breath. The new tortoise was still chomping away at the lettuce. My, Alfie, you do seem hungry today, Mrs. Silver was saying. It must be Mr. Hoppy's magic words I've been whispering to you. Mr. Hoppy watched as Mrs. Silver picked the tortoise up and stroked his shell. Then she fished Mr. Hoppy's piece of paper out of her pocket, holding the tortoise very close to her face, and she whispered, reading from the paper, Esio, Trot, Teg, Regub, Emoch, no, Esio, Trot, Wurg, Poo, Foop, Poo, Tus, Poo, Ngert, Poo, Wol, Poo, Sluice, Poo, Egrog, Elgazug, Foots, Plug, Tup, no, Taff, Esio, Trot, Tup, no, Taff, Teg, no, Elbog, Doof. They're crazy words, aren't they? Mr. Hoppy popped his head out of the foliage and called, Good evening, Mrs. Silver. How is Alfie tonight? Oh, he's lovely, Mrs. Silver said, looking up and beaming. And he's developing such an appetite. I've never seen him eat like this before. It must be the magic words. You never know, Mr. Hoppy said darkly. You never know. Mr. Hoppy waited 7 whole days before he made his next move. On the afternoon of the 7th day, when Mrs. Silver was at work, he lifted tortoise number 2 from the balcony below and brought it into his living room. Number 2 had weighed exactly 15 ounces. He must now find one that weighed exactly 17 ounces, 2 ounces more. From his enormous collection, he easily found a 17-ounce tortoise, and once again he made sure the shells matched in colour. Then he lowered tortoise number 3 onto Mrs. Silver's balcony. As you would have guessed by now, Mr. Hoppy's secret was a very simple one. If a creature grows slowly enough, and I mean very slowly indeed, then you'll never notice that it is growing at all, especially if you see it every day. It's the same with children. They're actually growing taller every week, but their mothers never notice until they grow out of their clothes. Slowly does it, Mr. Hoppy told himself. Don't hurry it. So this is how things went over the next 8 weeks. In the beginning, Alfie weighed 13 ounces. End of the first week, tortoise number 2 weighed 15 ounces. End of the second week, tortoise number 3 weighed 17 ounces. End of the third week, tortoise number 4, 19 ounces. End of the fourth week, tortoise number 5, 21 ounces. End of the fifth week, tortoise number 6, 23 ounces. Always 2 more every week, isn't it? End of the sixth week, tortoise number 7, 25 ounces. End of the 7th week, tortoise number 8, 27 ounces. Alfie's weight was 13 ounces. Tortoise number 8 was 27 ounces. Very slowly, over 7 weeks, Mrs. Silver's pet had more than doubled in size, and the good lady hadn't noticed a thing. Even to Mr. Hoppy, peering down over his railing, tortoise number 8 looked pretty big. It was amazing that Mrs. Silver had hardly noticed anything at all during the great operation. Only once had she looked up and said, You know, Mr. Hoppy, I do believe he's getting a bit bigger. What do you think? I can't see a lot of difference myself, Mr. Hoppy had answered casually. Right. Tomorrow, we're going to finish this story. We're nearly done. We're going to find out if Mrs. Silver works out what Mr. Hoppy's been playing at, or if Mr. Hoppy will win his love. He loves Mrs. Silver. Maybe she'll love him back. We'll find out tomorrow. See you later.